Well, I'm here with Alex Kaschuta, who is the host of a podcast called Subversive, which is all about the outcast, according to the description here. So thanks for joining me, Alex.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Well, very good. Now, tell me a little bit about your podcast. Why is it a podcast for outcasts?
Essentially, it's trying to provide a platform for kind of the marginalized academics, the journalists who sometimes write about the naughty subjects, all the people that have been either deplatformed or kind of pushed to the edge of the conversation. And I happen to know a lot of these people because I run in those circles. And I thought, I'm having these conversations here, in the DM groups and in kind of a hidden circle. So why not try to kind of create a bit of light on conversations that are not had in the mainstream.
Mhm. And that's kind of in the same vein of what we do on A Neighbor's Choice, my radio program, where we try to give a voice to the scapegoat. We try to give a voice to the one that's marginalized. And there's also things like the intellectual dark web, which is trying to provide voices for people who are not fitting into the normal footprint. So this seems to be something that's kind of emerging, right? There's just a lot of little outcast type conversations that are starting to be branded on the internet.
Yeah, I think it's because the center is consolidating really, really solidly recently, and they're all kind of the scapegoating has intensified in the last in the last few years, and especially now with all the political turmoil. More people and more visible people have been marginalized or have been cast out of the global village, and more things that used to be quite normal in the 90s, as far as opinion goes, are now quite exotic, fringe discussions. So
Mm.
I think it's inevitable that people will start to, the more people are cast out from the temple, the more they'll congregate outside, and they'll build their own temple. So yeah,
Right.
hopefully I can be part of that.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that the whole project of the liberal mainstream or whatever is all about protecting the outcast. It's all about protecting the marginalized, and that when you do that, it ends up when you take that to the level that they're doing, where they do it by force, not just force in a physical coercion sense, but also force in terms of social, pressure and ostracization campaigns against those who don't fit their narrative. It's interesting because you end up expelling traditional boundaries and traditional standards and conventional norms, right? You end up only being able to expel those things if you want to have a mainstream that is enforcing a place for the outcast by force, which is what the left or the McWoke crowd is doing.
hmm Yeah, I think it's also interesting what who the outcast has become, because you kind of have the 1950s outcast would be someone with like long locks and prison tattoos, and that kind of the typical, I guess, Hollywood version of the renegade. At the moment, that's not the outcast. The outcast is anyone who wants to claw at traditional norms and try to hold on to anything that's not nailed down in terms of any sort of conventional ideas about how to live, are being severely attacked by the as part of not being inclusive to the supposed outcast, the person that we're all supposed to be inclusive towards. The idea of maintaining some form of social coordination through traditionalism is completely anathema to that. So we need to reject all of that so that we can embrace this hypothetical outcast.
Mhm. Why do you think that is happening now in 2020s? Where we're at.
Yeah, I think things are speeding up. I think timescales are compressing a lot because everything's so networked. I don't want to bring in the cliche of social media, but it is a reality, especially now in this year of pod life. We've been all forced to live in the pod, to eat the bugs this year. So we need to, it's all kind of accelerated even harder in terms of mimetic tribes and people kind of getting even more stuck in their ways mentally, and being in their echo chambers. So these fights have kind of reached a fever pitch now. And also there's just the factor of, COVID. People really are stressed. People have actual deprivation in their lives, so they might be clinging onto ideologies to, to give them some form of meaning.
Mhm. So would you say the elephant in the room is the digital age, the online, digital world that we're in? Is that why so much of convention is so rapidly becoming marginalized so quickly in aggressive ways? Or
I think it's
tradition,
a
I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a catalyst. I think it's a very, very strong catalyst for this reaction, but it's not, I don't think it's necessarily causal. I think we've kind of been on this track for a long time. I mean, you could make an argument that it's been going on since the Reformation, since, this concept of the liberated individual has been kind of enshrined, by John Stuart Mill, or there are many thinkers that kind of have tried to unshackle the individual from the chains of society, and they finally managed. And social media really is helping. Man, it's really kind of an accelerant for everything.
Yeah, I would think in some sense has been happening since, the times of the prophets in the Old Testament, and Jesus too, because, the idea of even having a story in that time period in which Jesus is asking a crowd about to stone a woman accused of adultery, right? And he's asking them who's going to cast the first stone. That's pretty subversive for that time. We look at that story with 2,000 years and we take it for granted, right? But to read that kind of a story in that landscape, that someone accused of violating a holy taboo like that could be defended, and that their life could have some sacred protection in that sense. Um, so I think we've been having this subversion against, um, this liberating subversion, right? This protection of the human person has been happening for some time, but like you're saying, it's kind of going off in a radical direction in recent times.
Yeah, and there might just be the fact that, without the concept of Christ, the subversion itself doesn't stand. There's no, it doesn't have a leg to stand on, because, there, you kind of need the metaphysical element to bolster the claim that, each individual has value, and, each individual has value in that particular Christian frame, and not just because that itself is not, a substantive claim.
Right. That's the kind of the running premise of my program, is that, if we're going to be able to understand political correctness and why the West acts the way it does, we have to understand that this is a religious type phenomenon that we're looking at. A lot of people, it's very fashionable now to say that, man, the woke left, it's so religious looking. And it's like, well, it's not religious looking, and it didn't just happen. These are ideologies, are vestiges of religion, right? And so they're like Christian heresies, basically. Socialism, Keynesian, these are all Christian heresies in my framework. And so you have to understand the kind of the domain of the sacred to be able to have an effective understanding for why this is happening, and why it looks the way it does, and why does it have the same patterns. Do you see that as helpful? And, do you have in your work, do you go into the, ancient past, or where do you like to spend your focus?
Maybe not necessarily in the ancient past, but I do look at, concepts like, in-group, out-group dynamics, and, the idea that, there's kind of one layer to reality, this kind of technocratic scientific layer that we're presented, where things are based on facts and logic, and we're
Mhm.
all debating at this level, and, the news is apparently at this level, but actually, things are, much more warlike, much more tribal, and much more based on kind of this eternal conflict between in-group and out-group. And kind of that's also where Girard, and my interest in Girard, comes in, because, he's kind of the main theoretician of, what happens if in-groups and out-groups collide, and kind of what the mechanisms are to release pressure. And if there's none, then we might have situations like today.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of, the sacred is that which you're not supposed to talk about, you're not supposed to touch, you're not supposed to, joke about it. And that's why in 2,000 years of Christian infection in the West, anybody who is considered to be expelled has a kind of sacred aura that's placed on them, which is a very interesting conundrum that we're in. As you mentioned, is that the more homeschoolers and the more conservative, traditionalist family structures are expelled and marginalized by the dominant hegemony or whatever, the more they're going to take on a sacred aura from the folks that watch this take place. And so my whole running premise is that we have to understand that meaning of the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That is the heart of everything we see around us. For example, in the 1990s or 80s in America, if you were a kid struggling with a gender identity in a high school, you'd be in a real bind there, in terms of your social status, right? You could be really marginalized unless you were in a really unique situation in America in the 1980s and 90s, right? And now fast forward to 2020, and the trans identity has now become a kind of sacred, right? By being expelled, by being bullied, by being picked on, by being marginalized, it creates this kind of sacred status that enshrines it with power. And I think this is directly a product of our culture being baked in a Judeo-Christian aesthetic that has symbols like the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It's in the act of being rejected that someone has power in this world, right? And it is fully in the world of the fishbowl of Christianity that we have to navigate this. And so,
Yeah. And it's interesting how abstract this has become because, in the case of transgender, teenagers, I could imagine, there's actual rejection, there's actual, friction, it relates to phenomena in reality. But for example, in gender relations, between men and women, a lot of the mythology that, is a lot of, for example, the pay gap or things that, people keep drawing on as sacred mythology to motivate the fervent, the zealotry of gender wars, they're factually absolutely provably untrue. But they're sacred artifacts. They're always brought into the conversation. And even if you even just bring your spreadsheet and try to show that this is this doesn't work, there's complete selective blindness to that because it's clear that we have decided maybe at a time when these things were actually real, that this is a sacred dimension, and we shall, these are things that we shall not talk about, or at least not talk about in terms so crass as of evidence or truth. It's quite interesting how things drift away from the factual, even if they used to be factual, and now they're once they're in the sacred dimension. I guess you need an event like this where so many people are excluded from the mainstream by pointing out the truth of the matter, that we'll just have to make our own temple outside the gates, because I don't really see how we're going to be recapturing the institutions from inside the city walls, because it doesn't seem to be happening.
so now you sound like an anarchist a little bit there, huh? You have to build a new
It's just a metaphor. It's just a metaphor. No, but I mean, the institutions obviously not necessarily referring to City Hall, but like even like media, things like this.
I would say they have to include that, though.
I mean, yeah, in the long term, but right. We start with podcasts and then we move on to City Hall.
I don't know. I think the Postal Service is really the heart of the matter for dealing with the decline of our culture. When you look at, you mentioned the issue of gender issues, and Rene Girard has a line where he basically says, the reason we talk about sex so much is because the real taboo is envy. Envy is the real taboo. We act like sex is the taboo topic, but it's actually envy that's actually the real taboo that nobody wants to talk about. And so much of gender identity and all these issues are wrapped in with envy. It's the idea of, well, I can't get attention, so if I change my gender allegiance somehow, maybe I can get some attention some way, right? Maybe I can get that kind of adoration that that's been neglected towards me all this time. And folks who would normally be passed aside, if they change an identity and their gender, somehow they get to become, the center of the attention, the center of affection, the center of, loyalty and protection,
Yeah, I think that's kind of a very visible example, but you see people kind of stacking all sorts of identities and valences of, even sexual proclivities, furries, things like that, and then if you go to someone who's kind of in thrall with this ideology, and if you go to one of their social media accounts, you can see that there's essentially a stack of colorful identities and different ways that they distinguish themselves.
Mhm.
And probably, it must tie into this, being a neutral person, being a bit bland, trying to stand out and trying to, kind of construct yourself into this peacock type persona that maybe, you weren't gifted with, at the beginning of your life, and you kind of want to stand out.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, why is it, I mean, you see this everywhere. You see, Donald Trump is marginalized because he has supermodel wives and stuff like that. And yet Bill Clinton is got a standing rape accusation, but yet he's on the political side that he's supposed to be. So therefore he gets kind of a pass, and he's allowed to come to the inauguration with a lot of comfort. But you see these kind of weird, shifting standards of what is supposed to be taboo and what is supposed to be given a pass, And I think a lot of it has to do probably with envy. Bill Clinton postures on a victim branded, culture. He postures with victim language and victim speech, and Trump doesn't. He has a golden toilet. And so therefore his supermodel wife has to be scandalized as this is garish, this is ugly, this is fake.
Yeah, and there's that, and I also think there's kind of an aesthetic component to Trump, because he kind of has this, jet ski salesman aesthetic, someone kind of who's working class, who's made a lot of money, and kind of has that garish look that, people who are, like kind of East Coast elites, they don't digest that very well. These are the people they avoid at dinner parties,
Yeah.
and I think there's quite an element of disgust in the anti-Trump faction, and also the Lincoln Projects, the conservatives that are never Trumpers. To me, like every time I read one of their op-eds or something, it's usually, it could be boiled down to Trump disgusts me, and he should disgust you too, and
Right.
that's about it.
And why is it disgusting? Is it just the idea of someone from the middle class that doesn't have class coming into wealth and not knowing
Yeah,
how
it's
to hide
definitely
it?
just an big in-group out-group dynamic,
Mhm.
where Trump is someone who kind of has the trappings of someone who would be an East Coast elite, or he maybe has more money than people who are like Harvard professors, or it's kind of like that Marxist college professor tension, where there's always the unhappiness that they're not making as much money as their intellectual standing would warrant. But and it's also, he's a wealthy industrialist, and yeah, that's always going to be a bit of a tension with people who want to be classy for other reasons, not for their money, though they have money.
Yeah. And that's, the merchant class has always been the scapegoat for a lot of different, ideologies. And that's something I wanted to get into a little bit, because I know you talk about liberalism and the idea of, going to a more traditional conceptions of life, that liberalism alone can't seem to provide us, uh, you know, the substance that we are looking for. But at the same time, it seems that all these different ideologies, whether it's on the right or the left, they're always agreeing that, yeah, well, liberalism's the problem, which in some ways, to me, as someone who has a soft spot for entrepreneurs and has tried to start businesses in the past myself and so forth, I've never shared that. I understand the critique of consumerism and materialism and so forth, but this idea that somehow, a libertarian market or something is somehow intrinsically tied to a consumerist or individualist aesthetic about our communities, I don't think is necessarily true, but yet you see that on both the left and the right, both the interesting
Yeah.
left and the interesting right both agree. Yeah. This
It's a tough one. To be honest, I'm also all for, the small business, entrepreneurship, low taxes. I'm definitely have a big soft spot for pure libertarianism. But if you look at it from the perspective of the global market, of the interconnectedness of everything, and kind of once capital gets to a certain scale, kind of like in multinationals or supranational organizations that are there, through lobbying to help many of these multinational organizations achieve their goals, that's a different beast. And, that's kind of, a lot of libertarians have no problem with that because that's, just the free market doing its bidding. But, the phenomena that emerge from that, the monopolistic tendencies, oligopolies in every industry, what big tech is doing now, they're essentially a parallel government, unregulated and maybe even, impossible to regulate because they just, they're the complexities of the system that's shifting every day is something that, the government will not know how to regulate. And I don't even know if it should, because, whenever the government steps in and tries to get its grubby fingers into anything, it just ends up, destroying value and not really knowing what to do, or catering to the interests of who knows what lobbyists or interest groups. So yeah, it's a very tough question. I don't know if there's a solution, but I think there is still a deep connection between kind of this unfettered uh, high scale capitalism and the destruction of local communities. And for example, the idea that because you could produce iron ore cheap, like 10 cents cheaper in China, you should just destroy a whole sub-region of the United States because these people are more expensive and things like that. That's a lot of libertarians would just whistle and turn around and say, yeah, that's creative destruction. But there's been so much creative destruction in so many places with no consequence to the people implementing it, that I think to me, capitalism is an amazing tool. And I'm from Eastern Europe, and I'm all pro this tool because it's miraculous. But I think having it as a master, having growth as our only goal, has been really destructive, especially in the absence of like strong morality coming from somewhere else. Which and I think these two rubbing up against each other, I really think this has weakened communities and people staying together and all this type of stuff throughout the time. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's kind of a vicious circle happening.
Right. Yeah. And I agree that I don't like the common libertarian, you know, stance towards saying, oh, they can do whatever they want. They're a company. It's just not exactly um, that's not required to believe in the principles of, say, non-aggression or non-vengeance and apply that in a legal sense, to politics. You don't have to, just because it may be legal to do something doesn't mean you should be like saying, I have no critique for it. You know what I mean? You should be able to critique market actions very, very strong and socially ostracize them, and socially, it's, for example, I'm okay with ending the war on drugs, but that doesn't mean that therefore we are going to sacralize the human consumption of drugs and say, well, that's not, I can't judge it. No, we can shame it without putting you in an assault case. You know what I mean? We can shame this
Yeah,
in
I think
other social, institutions like church, like community, like,
Yeah, I feel like my pushback against that would just be that by creating you know having this libertarian society, the libertarian society, and kind of what the second stage effects are from complete liberalization. These are all very pleasant things. Drugs are great. Prostitution is amazing, especially now, like digitally intermediated forms of prostitution. They're extremely addictive. And if you just say, okay, you can have all of this, but our vanguard is going to be our faith. There's going to be church and there's going to be community. These things, because they're just bombarding the individual with these super normal stimuli day in and day out, they're weakening the resolve. If a man is strong, but he's only this strong, and you can see this with food as well. Food is packed with all of these super normal stimuli. People are overweight, not necessarily because their will is weak, but because these products are made to be addictive. They're so specialized and they're so refined that people really do love the hyper palatable McDonald's and all this stuff. And it's the same with all sorts of food categories and all sorts of things that are not evil, but they've just been so refined, they've just been iterated so much through the market forces that they found out, yeah, this is the product that this client is going to buy every time because it's just so good. We've turned this client into kind of an addict. They're just going to be consuming this stuff. And the thing is, if you have the completely liberated market, this hydra, it's going to be really hard for a community to compete with it because it's expedient,
Right.
it's cheap, it's there at every corner, and it really does weaken your relation to your fellow man. Like, internet's so addictive, people barely see their children anymore. So these are kind of epiphenomena of the free market. They're really cool, I love them, but they're also, they're corrosive.
Right. Yeah. That's what I'm kind of raising, is that it's an interesting conundrum we're in. And that's what we're talking about, is how do we have traditional society, but yet still actually do it in real life? Like, not just do this little LARPing stuff of acting like, we're all about traditionalism, but actually trying to like bring this into reality, right? Make something that can last, that people want to be a part of. And that is an interesting, discussion that we need to have, which is, because from my conception, I have concluded voluntarism through looking at Jesus's, commandments to his followers when he says, "Do not resist evil with violence." And so I don't need to go to the NAP. I don't need to go to Bastiat. Bastiat's just imitating a derivative of Jesus. I can go to the original source, which isn't going to give me exactly. It's not exactly libertarianism. It's something much more interesting, right? Where you have this radical free will, this radical free choice that is in reflection to your creator, who is radically free to create, and you're made in his image. And so the idea of taking care of the Good Samaritan is that choice that you make to take on the skin in the game of going and helping your neighbor, and the same thing for dealing with abuse and shame. When Jesus is talking about do not resist evil with violence, he's not talking about self-defense matters. He's talking about shame. When someone hits you, backhands you, that's a shame. And so do you respond to that shame with a kind of force or a reciprocity that can easily spiral out, as with mimetic theory, into a contagion of conflict? And so that's the question that we have to wrestle with, is how do we, because my whole thing is, I have no interest in the deification of the individual, like libertarianism. It's the opposite. It's the idea that we should take care of our neighbor. But the question is, how do we take care of our neighbor? Do we use force? If my neighbor's addicted to a drug, if I barge down the house and, tase them and put them in a cage to have a timeout from their little son for 10 years, is that really helping them with their addiction? Is that really the way Jesus would handle the issues of the heart? Or would he say maybe some tough love, but not some kind of form of torture and separation of families? So, this is an interesting discussion. So,
Yeah, for sure.
we need
I
to
feel
work it
like
out.
it's a discussion of our time. This is a problem that's unfolding in real time, and I think I don't know any person who's not struggling with some aspect of it, be it the community aspect or the addiction aspect or things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think we're gonna solve it on this
Yeah.
podcast, which we're really trying.
Right. Yeah. It's just one of those things that I think, I see the voices that represent libertarianism, and I see them typically having a very modernistic, individualistic aesthetic, right? And then I
Yeah.
see folks who are for traditional values in the public square, and yet they're just kind of defaulting to some kind of collectivist notion of government. And I just don't see if those things have to be mutually like separated in that way. You know what I mean? That there should be a way to have kind of a harmonization of some of these things together.
Yeah, I think, hypothetically, in like a Christian society, if you had a kind of a kind of a nuclear Christian society, a form of libertarianism would probably be the best way to organize things.
Mhm.
But because our societies are really heterogeneous, and the coordination mechanisms are very weakened because we don't really speak the same language, either literally or morally. There's no moral consensus except for don't be intolerant. Okay, that's the one rule you get, and outside of that, you can kind of bend morality to your will. So I think, ideally, yeah, I would agree with you, but I feel like the kind of the game theoretic equilibrium we're in, or disequilibrium we're in, I don't think pure libertarianism, or a form of like that the kind of anarcho-capitalism would work. Like it's like the question you hear often between the fight between the Cato Institute and kind of more post-liberal conservatives is the idea of open borders. Most libertarians will tell you that open borders are good because it's a libertarian principle, more freedom is better. At the same time, you have a huge welfare state, which you're not going to dissolve overnight. So that's the field of play. That's the setting that you're in. So you can't open the borders.
And the funniest one is
Yeah.
is when you ask the open border libertarians, do you like the idea of secession as a way of breaking up big government and big countries? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, well, if someone secedes, they're going to have a border of some sort, right? You know what I mean? And they never really square
but they
that
secede
one, right?
with freedom.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like,
they exercise freedom in the act of secession.
Yeah, I mean, because I know a lot of these open border libertarian types, they're very big on, we need to go down to city-state models like Liechtenstein or something like that all over the world. But it's like, in order to be a Liechtenstein or whatever, you have to have some kind of border, right? You have to have some kind of measure about who's just coming and going, or else you don't have a city-state. You're just part of an empire or whatever, part of a bigger country.
Yeah, I think they would say it's probably more tied to the fact that none of these states will have a welfare state, probably these ideal city states. So the incentives to migrate will be very low. But yeah, this is all very hypothetical. That's what I think it's good to think in hypotheticals, but also in our current reality, a lot of the cool libertarian thought experiments just don't pan out.
So is your background, have you been in a traditional Christian environment growing up, or how did you move to this conclusion is where you're at now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm nominally Catholic. I didn't really grow up, religious. My family is quite, Eastern European, non-Christian, just because, not necessarily because they were non-believers, but essentially that was kind of imposed. People weren't supposed to be worshiping, and they took it literally in my family. So I mean, I'm from a Polish and German Catholic family. And I've kind of come to these conclusions slower and later in life, essentially kind of looking at things like, coordination. I used to be kind of in rationalist circles, and, looking at game theory and just, looking at the world as it is, and, realizing that the only viable equilibrium that exists is in Christianity, in my opinion, in different forms of Christianity, but that's essentially kind of the best it got for humans. And things, people like Girard come in, and they kind of give a lot of context to these situations and why this is, and why certain things can be and certain things can't. So I've taken the long road to this to this conclusion. It's definitely not been like a natural thing. I used to be a very virulent new atheist.
Who was your favorite of those guys?
It's Hitchens, because he's just so verbally skilled. I just love his little aphorisms.
Did you ever see, there was a documentary with him and a pastor named Douglas Wilson called Collision, in which they debated Christianity? Did you ever see that?
Yeah, I thought Wilson was so owned.
He was using a presuppositional apologetics about the whole idea of by what standard should you care, Christopher Hitchens, about all the injustices of the world if there is no God. It doesn't have any appeal to you, that type of approach to Christianity? Apologetics, the presuppositional.
To be honest, I haven't really revisited that whole line of argument. I just remember I was, kind of excited about hitch slaps back then. But
so what? I guess what I'm saying is, what was the entry point into Christianity that got you over to that direction?
seeing no other choice. Essentially, I shoehorned myself into it just by almost by pure logic. I was
So,
like, this,
so more
yeah.
like this is the Western tradition that seemed to be the most stable. So let's just, in a kind of pragmatic sense, let's just use it.
Yeah, that was kind of the first step. Obviously, from then on, I did much more reading, and I've read, my C.S. Lewis, and I think Girard was a big part of it as well. Like I feel like
Mhm.
my conception of Christianity is pretty close to Girard's. It's kind of it's I'm still kind of one step back from it. I'm not, probably not the most fervent Christian, but I would, consider myself a Catholic now. Think something I wouldn't have said, maybe definitely not 10 years ago.
So, what was it about Rene Girard's work that kind of you found the most value in
Yeah.
accepting Christianity in some fashion?
I think to me it was really startling, when he was describing, reading the Golden Bow by Fraser, and his discovery that, though Fraser obviously does an amazing job, kind of, analyzing taboo and the sacrifice in ancient societies. Kind of Girard's discovery was that, Christianity is a break from all of this, because I think Fraser lumps Christianity in with all the myths and old school, pagan rituals. But that break, and the how revolutionary that break was, to the scapegoating of humanity. So,
Right.
it was quite a shock to me how much of an innovation that was, and how important and how ignored the value of this is, and how, because now, like you said, we've had 2,000 years of this. Everyone's taking it for granted. Everything's, it's as part of the water we swim in. But understanding, ritual violence and all of this, this idea is completely revolutionary. So to me, that was kind of it was a moment of clarity where I saw, okay, this is some real, revelation here.
Right. Yeah. And the idea of kind of where we're heading now, kind of to tie us with the Girard uh, idea, is that we're in this kind of sacrificial crisis where we don't have any um, we don't have any unifying myth that can allow us to kind of have a transcendent togetherness and kind of do our own thing and stay in our own lane and do our own collaborations and all get along, because we don't have that uniting myth anymore. We've had so much undermining of the scapegoat mechanism in our society. And I think this is where politics and the state go hand in hand with the culture. Um, See, I believe that one of the reasons why the church is not listened to well, there's a few things. One, we don't do miracles anymore, so we don't have Teslas like Nikola Tesla, not the car. We're not doing, like, the church's vocation in the earth is supposed to, like, be co-creators with Christ. I mean, with God. We when Christ redeems humanity, it brings us back to the fulfillment of the dominion mandate in Genesis, which is to create, to make the earth a better place, to not pollute the earth, but to actually, find those amazing things that we can use to, make humanity a better place and make the earth a more beautiful temple, right? In the reflection of God's beauty. And we don't have that anymore. Christianity has become something, for whatever reason, something that is in kind of the last place you would go to look for the next Tesla, Nikola Tesla, or the next Einstein type, and that's, I think, a big problem, is that the church has not done its job to imitate the life of Christ. Because what did Jesus do when he was trying to explain to people why they should follow him? He did miracles. It shouldn't be the government that's saying we're going to have a war on cancer with Nixon. It should be the church. There should be lots and lots of labs in churches, as my friend Shannon Braswell likes to say. We should have chemistry labs in every church. The church should be the place, because we were the place that birthed this idea of modern science. But for whatever reason, evolution and all these other different things, it became like, no, these are totally separate things. And
Yeah.
so I think, Jesus was able to persuade people to look at him by doing miracles, and we should imitate him if we're his body on earth.
Yeah, I think the kind of the secular arm of science have taken over miracles completely, and it's and it shows. I feel like I think if you ask the your average person, how does your microwave work, their explanation is going to be akin to, oh, it's nuking it
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah.
So it's it is a miracle, things, especially with microelectronics and things like that. It's the second you go past fifth grade physics, the miracles happen. And it's not surprising that tech or overlords are tech people, because they're kind of manipulators of this magical material, and we trust them because they have delivered. I mean, from Jonas Salk to Tesla, the new Tesla, to magical computers in your pocket. It's quite shocking. And I think the second the church kind of accepted its role as the place you go on Sunday, rather than being tied into leadership structures. And I know the separation of church and state had a good logic behind it, but it was also a bit of a turning point, because the church obviously took a secondary role. It was a place that gave you guidance, but it didn't necessarily have a leading role in your life.
And that's one of the reasons why Girard's approach to anthropology in the Bible is so essential right now, because it's if you only have a theology of Jesus, you don't have an accurate picture of Jesus, right? But most churches and theological centers of influence in America, they're just operating on a theology of Jesus, which is Jesus said he's the Son of God and the Son of Man. So he should give it, and he actually says he's the Son of Man more than he does to say that he emphasizes the Son of God part, which means that he has more to say to us about what humankind is like. By looking at his life, you will be able to see, like Girard pointed out in the scriptures, that this deconstructs the origins of humankind and why we make the institutions we do, and why they operate the way they do, and why our conflicts look the same mechanistic way. That's what the Bible is there for. And if we had that anthropological foundation, going along our theology in the church institutions and the seminaries and so forth, I think we would have a more grounded approach to how to live out the Christian life. We would be able to uh, kind of have the epistemology that Jesus has, to be able to look at scientism and say, hey, wait a second, that's a sacred cow too. That's a religious structure too. That's a bunch of priestly caste folks who are backed up by the state, giving them monopoly grants, and they get monopoly, power over what is science and what peer review journals are accepted and whatever, and who gets the position on the chairman of a scientific department in a university. And they get to have that monopoly. And what's really going on is not settled science oftentimes, but rather social science. It's about, hey, these esteemed colleagues in our past said this was true. They did some studies that kind of hinted that it was. It's settled. Let's move on, right? But so much of what like we accept as settled science in the world of physics and all these different things would be more rightly contested if Christians had the same approach to being skeptical of those sacred bodies as Jesus did when he was on earth to the sacred bodies that he engaged in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, I think wasn't it also Girard's intention that, to kind of solve the issue of the end times, people should come to this understanding of this, once the scapegoating mechanism is known by all, then, in a way, heaven on earth can descend upon us, because that's essentially the key to everything. That's why Girard is so revolutionary, because he presents, kind of the best, I think, theory of human conflict that exists, and within it, the key to solving or at least alleviating human conflict. Because once you know how the sausage is made, you can kind of you can kind of go and maybe not engineer around, but at least have the presence of mind to deal with the problem on the terms that it's presented.
Right. That's my, And Rene Girard would say you have to renounce the violence, not just see the scapegoating, right? Because we can see it, and then we try to come up with an excuse to do revenge scapegoating, which is what the left is all about. It's all about, I call it revenge of the nerd Christianity, where it's all about, okay, now we've got the power. It's time to get revenge on all these people who have made us feel ugly or poor or whatever. Now let's get revenge on them because it's okay. And that's just simply not. The image of Jesus is the slain lamb, not the slain lamb with a machine gun, right? And that's so we don't have that, and that's so we're kind of like halfway there. We're in this really weird spot where it can go really bad, because we see victims everywhere, and we see we're haunted by oppression, and we're haunted by, oh my goodness, if I open the door, am I oppressing this person? For this lady because you're making her feel different. Well, all of this is a product of the scapegoat mechanism unraveling, because the original scapegoat mechanism was meant to preserve differentiation, right? And it was meant to preserve hierarchy and boundaries and differentiation. And so the more it doesn't work, the more we're haunted by, oh, am I oppressing you with that act of differentiation? The act of selection, the act of preference, the act of is there something different about genders, and should we keep that going? And what happens is that the more we're aware of that scapegoating mechanism, the more we're basically differentiation can be the occasion for scapegoating, right? So if you're in a sea of sameness, and there's the one with the witch-looking nose with the big wart on it or something, in a sea of sameness, oh, that's the one, she did it, right? Or he did it. They're the ones that put a spell on us, and that's why you and me are hating each other right now, because we're fighting over who stole whose chicken in the primordial tribe of this situation. So we're fighting over all this stuff. Actually, she put a spell on us. Let's get her because she's standing out, or he's standing out in some way. They're too old, too poor, too pretty, too ugly, too whatever. Something that makes them stand out, and that's what the left is super freaked out about, right? They don't want us to point out that things stand out, that things are different, right? They don't want it to be that, 80% of people in engineering departments are male, because they feel like, well, that means you're basically creating the conditions for a female to be scapegoated on the hierarchy, that they won't have access to that kind of power of what it means to be an engineer, right? And so they're hyper aware of that differentiation being the occasion for a sacrifice. But the Christian response is to say, well, no, it's not always the case. It doesn't. We don't have to scapegoat differentiation as a kind of preemptive protection from sacrifice. You see what I mean? And that's the argument that needs to be happening right now, is that we can come alongside people who are marginalized, like the trans kid or whatever. We can say, don't bully them, but we're also not going to sacralize this because they've been bullied. You see what I mean? That's the kind of, we stand in defense of victims, but it's like Jesus, right? He's protecting the woman from adultery, right? And the left, he's protecting her from being stoned for the adultery thing. And the left wants to, stone Jesus because he said, go and sin no more. And the right wants to stone the woman because she was accused of adultery. And we have to choose neither option. We have to say, no, I will protect this person. I will defend them from being scapegoated, but at the same time, I will acknowledge that we don't like this happening, right? And so go and sin no more. That's the differentiation that the left is insane about, right?
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important topic, and something I've written about as well on stigma, because I feel like this is, to me, stigma is kind of a very important social function. It's there for coordination. It tells me, what what you're probably going to do. It tells you what's good to do in the society that you've grown up in. And I see this push from the left, especially to normalize, to destigmatize, normalize all sorts of things that, the only way to release people from the shackles of unfreedom is to free them from all of these conventions that a lot of times have a social purpose, like the idea that prostitution is probably going to be bad for you. The purpose of that is not just to shield the individual woman from the immediate consequences of prostitution, which obviously are not that good. There's a lot of mental health consequences and all sorts of things that could happen, but also to shield society from, kind of the mimetic effect of prostitution, because people don't do things in a vacuum. They do them, and then the people around them get influenced, the community. It's mimesis. So society, a society can't afford to have half the population be in prostitution. Obviously that's not a viable equilibrium, but it's stigma is the way that a society coordinates so that most women will end up in families, have children, because it is stigmatized to go be a sex worker. And I feel like this is a very important dimension. No one's really, very few people are talking about it, and it's seen as an unalloyed terrible thing that we need to get rid of, because our societies are going to collapse under the weight of so much shame. But I think it doesn't destroy shame. It just deviates it. It's not like you're not relieving this person of shame. You're just moving the river path.
Yeah, it's a tricky topic. I'll go back to the drug thing. So this is the way I look at the issue: people being locked. I've had people on my show who've been in prison for life for first time nonviolent involvement with marijuana even. Okay. So one of them, Craig Cecil, he just got clemency from Donald Trump. He called into my show from prison, 2 years ago, asking for clemency. He was trying to be reunited with his daughter. He was doing body work on trucks moving marijuana across the border. Everybody who actually handled the marijuana, they took a plea deal. He went to trial. He exercised his right. And in an anti-Christian culture, he went to serve life in prison for this. This is not the way Jesus would handle this kind of situation, right? But this is the way Satan works. The satanic system, the satanic scapegoat mechanism. The way it works is, it creates this injustice. It creates this brokenness. It creates this oppression. And then Satan gets ahead of the curve and he says, well, I've got to stop. I can't let this be a good victory for the good guys. So I'm going to go ahead and get ahead of this trend and make it so that it's cool to not stigmatize weed culture, right? So yeah, you're going to get your legalization, Christian, peacemakers. You're not going to be able to. We're not going to be able to scapegoat people into the bowels of prison amongst rapists and murderers who come in and out of the prison longer than Craig. They're coming in and out of prison before Craig's released. So yeah, you won on that, but we're gonna mar the victory by bringing in this kind of aesthetic of, well, we're going to celebrate and sacralize stoner culture, right? And so for me, I'm looking at that. I'm like, oh man, I hear the traditional folks and conservatives telling me, hey, don't get on the bandwagon of legalizing the drug because look what it's doing. It's all about celebrating stoner culture. But then I'm hearing the message of Jesus in my other ear saying, hey, you don't wait for the ideal conditions. If you see your neighbors in pain, and they're being scandalized, you don't just say, well, in an ideal scenario, when we get 80% Christian again and all this stuff, yeah, we'll get Craig Cecil out so he can walk his daughter down the aisle for marriage. No, you go and you help your neighbor. And that Christian, that Christian obligation to stand on the side of a neighbor who's being scapegoated has to compel us to do the right thing, even though the scapegoat mechanism machine, is going to get ahead of the curve and try to say, well, we're legalizing it because we're going to celebrate stoner culture. And it's like, no, I'm not on board with that. And I'm going to condemn that and keep that stigma going. We're not going to celebrate stoner culture. That's just the satanic perversion of the process that's happening when the scapegoat mechanism is being exposed by people's consciences that are pricked by the cross, you see? And that's that weird, it's like a escalation, a detente. You see what I mean?
Yeah. How much of this do you think is just the fact that, it's very hard for humans to keep ambiguity about someone in their mind? I feel like we kind of have this a bit of a black and white thinking about moral character, and it's a bit, are you with us or are you against us? And I feel like a lot of times when we try to move something from, like a Craig's situation into, we not only need to legalize this and, provide protections for these people, but we kind of need to pull, we really need to go off the rails and sanctify this so people understand why we did legalize it. Right. And, to get, okay, these are the good guys, because not only are they good, they're sacredly good. Right. They're the best guys. So I feel like not necessarily as a rhetorical device, but maybe as a thinking issue, that we cannot have moral ambiguity about someone. I think maybe that's also an innovation that Christ brought in,
Right.
because Mary Magdalene was in an ultimate state of moral ambiguity, because she was a sinner, but at the same time, we should not murder her. And we will kind of have to sit with that ambiguity and understand that about all of us, that we all are in moral ambiguity.
Right.
And it's I think that's a it's a very tricky state to be in, and we see people flip-flopping all the time from one end to the other, because it's just really uncomfortable.
That's the kind of project I'm trying to do, is how do we thread that needle, which is to be able to have the stigma, because I like that the way you framed it, but not to use the coercion, because the coercion is the scapegoat mechanism falling apart. That's kind of what I'm trying to explain to people. I call it the impotent sacrifice, which is that even if we want to have a robust government policing our choices and keeping everybody being, behaving, and even if we want to believe that, maybe conservative traditionalist types could get a hold of that and make policies and interventions that are more pro-family in their outcome, right? Maybe if we wanted that, if you understand Girard and you understand what the Bible's doing, we can't. It's called, because it's the impotence of sacrifice. The idea is that you can't create that unity and that catharsis and that consensus and that unanimity that it's okay to, to sacrifice someone and put someone in prison for life for marijuana. And furthermore, it's impotent in the sense that we're not willing to do the level of violence that would deter people in the first place. You see what I mean? Because I tell people, it's like, if you really, because these people say, oh no, we got to get tougher on drugs, let's get tougher on drugs. We're going to get conservatives, we're going to get here. I'm like, how is it tough to put people in a prison where you're going to feed them 3 square meals and you're going to give them a college education? It's kind of like a nanny state, and that's like an overbearing mother. Like, you're not tough, like tough in that old fashioned sense, in a pagan sense. Why don't you crucify the people who've been, selling a lot of coke or heroin? Crucify them in the public square of your local town. Have the sheriff put it on C-SPAN or whatever your local county television is. That's the way pagans would do it before Jesus. If there's a problem like fentanyl and it's really wiping everybody out, then act like a good, tough pagan and crucify people and put it on that cheap little public access television show, so that maybe then a drug dealer would be like, I don't know, this guy's crazy. I don't know how they got away with doing this. I don't think I'm going to sell. I'm going to throw this stuff in the trash. That's the only kind of level of violence that would be able to stamp out, right, and deter people the way pagans used to do. Romans, you'd walk into a new city, you'd see a field of people crucified. And that was a lesson that you don't step out of line to that which they tell you to do in their law. And we don't have that, because Jesus has filed down the teeth of the scapegoat mechanism for 2,000 years, especially the cultures that have been baked in it in his story the most, right? And so we're kind of left as if the bumpers of bowling have been taken off, and now we have to bowl. We have to hit a strike, or we're going down. It's the training wheels of history are off. The training wheels were the scapegoat mechanism. It was the placenta of religion that we were in. And that's the problem I have with traditional conservative political ideals, is that you're missing it. The scapegoat mechanism is broken. You can't patch it back together and glue it back. The cat's out of the bag. The magic trick is exposed. So now we have to build alternative institutions and alternative ways of enforcing stigma and difference and boundaries without the threat of expulsion in a physical sense. You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is a very big factor as well, because it also ties into the death of traditional community, because a lot of the stigma was essentially expulsion. It was the threat of exile, and we still kind of have those intense feelings when we're stigmatized, but there's also a bit of getting used to the stimulus. So people aren't that frightened of stigma, or they can just move, they can just exit their community and move somewhere else, or things like that. And it's because localism is not a thing anymore,
Right.
then
Right. That's totally true. Now, I was just going to say that along those lines, that's why we can't cheapen violence as all the same, right? Like, I think it's violent to take someone for a drug or whatever, selling a drug, and take them and cage them away from their family for decades. I think that's a violent. I still think it's not as violent as crucifixion, obviously, but it is a kind of violence against the family and against the kids left at home and against their ability to work, and it destroys the culture. But at the same time, I like the violence of, in relationship, if my friend or my brother was addicted to fentanyl, I got to slap him in the face or punch him in the face. You see what I mean? But that's within a relationship. We don't have that with our justice system being our new God, our new messianic protector, our new nanny that we've had for some time. We don't have that relational connection that allows for the tough love of the punch to the face and you're fired and you're banished from my church and you know what I mean? We don't have that social shame mechanism alive and well because we have so long abrogated that responsibility to the nanny state to be our Messiah, protect us.
Yeah, and the nanny state is a very faulty Messiah because it's essentially the devouring mother, with her, multi tentacles, and whenever you make a mistake, and it's a mistake that could just ruin your life, but it doesn't really completely ruin your life because you're always got a little safety net. You can always escape. You can always, like even with the new trends in psychotherapy, a lot of them are oriented towards helping you escape from the confines of a traumatic past, relationship troubles, abusive families, all of this stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of relief in this and a lot of solutions being found, but there's also kind of this mechanism that, okay, you don't need to put up with this. If you don't like your neighbors, you don't need to put up with them. If you don't like your mother, never call her again. There's a lot of exit built into the system. And I think, it has a good part, obviously, because people don't need to, be coerced by other people into doing things. But at the same time, it's also corroding our capacity to live together, to punch your brother in the face if things go badly, because his option would be to just leave. He would just move to San Francisco, in a place where people are more tolerant of his lifestyle. So that the fact that we're not forced to live together has a lot of advantages, but also kind of has this breaking apart of the necessary connection where you could be accountable to your fellow man, where your neighbor was your neighbor and you were accountable to your neighbor, not just some person who lives in 7B who sometimes gets your mail. It's just in a way, not being forced to live together has made us be complacent about this stuff.
Right. It reminds me of that article that at the Tablet magazine, The New National American Elite by Michael Lynn.
Mm-hmm.
How America is ruled by a single elite rather than by local patrician smart sets, competing with each other. So we've nationalized everything. We've centralized everything into this. We've lost that local, culture that reinforces the status that people you need to, maintain to be considered a decent member of society. You're right. Yeah, we've scandalized the ability to put differences and expectations into what we'd expect our neighbor or a family member to adhere to. So, it's been an interesting discussion with you. I want to give you a chance to kind of tell us about some of the, kind of guests that you have on your podcast and what people can expect. It's about Outcasts, so that's obviously interesting to folks who are interested in mimetic theory and understanding the scapegoat and how that functions. So maybe you could give us a preview or a review of some of the guests you've had on recently and what people can expect.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've just had a handful of guests. The podcast is quite new. I mean, it's about a month old, so it's still at its beginning stages. Yeah, my first guests were, I had Rocco Miachon, who's a kind of a rationalist philosopher. He's the father of Rocco's Basilisk, which is kind of this thought experiment about AI, and that was a really interesting conversation about the future of technology, futurism. Then I also had Jeff Schollenberger on, who is quite an expert in postmodernism, and we discussed, because there's been a lot of talk of postmodernism, especially on the right, and it's a bit of a scapegoated ideology, and he was kind of there to dispel a lot of the mythology and kind of tell me about why postmodernism, has something to offer even to people nowadays. And our future guests are going to include one of my favorite political philosophers, Patrick Deneen. He just agreed to be on the show. Mary Harrington, who's a great writer on feminism and dating. A lot of people who might be a little bit on the fringes, but there's also some people that people might have heard of. So I'm very excited about it.
Well, very good. You can check it out, Subversive Podcast, right?
Yeah, Subversive Podcast.
Well, Alex, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, David.